Manitoba, a well-respected province and well-known province in Canada. Now, I promise you I'm not doing this on purpose, but we will be going once again back to Canada. Yes, it's Canada again. Yippee! As most of you guys probably don't know, because I'm an itty bitty channel and I know for a fact most of you are new. I made a video about Point Roberts. That was my first ever long form video. First try of a official long form video. And so we ended up going Point Roberts, Washington. But in order to do that, we had to go to British Columbia, Canada. And then last video that was just posted like a month ago at the time of recording, we ended up going to Regina, Saskatchewan, which is another province. And now this time, we are going to Winnipeg, Manitoba. This video, just like all the other ones I've done in the past, we're going to talk about the entire history of Manitoba. So we're kind of, I guess, going in chronological order, unironically here, because we had Saskatchewan, which is the neighbor of Manitoba, and then now we got Manitoba. And God forbid I somehow end up in Ontario, and then now I got to make a video about Ontario, and then Quebec, and then etc. And so, yeah, same thing with this video. We're going to be talking about indigenous tribes. I saved myself a lot of time because most of these tribes that we're going to talk about, I already talked about in the last video in Saskatchewan. Because as I mentioned, Manitoba and Saskatchewan are neighboring provinces. And so when the First Nations, before European settlements arrived, the Indigenous and First Nations were already within the territories of Manitoba and present-day Saskatchewan. And so when I get to talking about the tribes, I'm just going to mention them by name just because I already talked about their history. If you care a lot about knowing about that history, then you could check out my other video that I made about Saskatchewan, because I spent at least a quarter of the video talking about Indigenous and First Tribes history, as well as their culture and how the government worked and how it was with European settlers, wars and treaties. And so I decided that the only one I will be talking about is one that has not been mentioned because they were part of more or less the Manitoba area. And so stick around for that. That being said, let's talk about the entire history of Manitoba. So if you like anything that you see throughout this video and want to learn about history that absolutely no one asked about, please consider subscribing. As you can see, 8% of my viewers are subscribed. Wow! I'm equal to Mr. Beast. I am very happy for that. And I am grateful for now having 50 subscribers at the time of recording. So yeah, thank you. Please enjoy the video and consider subscribing at the end of the video if you enjoy what you're watching. I will not make you subscribe this early in the video because you hadn't even seen my content yet, you fakers. So as we begin to talk about the province Manitoba, we have to go way before Manitoba was even a thing and before Europeans were even a concept to natives and the First Nations. And just like tradition, I will now be pronouncing everything that I'm supposed to be pronouncing right, wrong. Because if there's one thing I am very good at is mispronouncing every single thing that comes across my way that is in English. Yay! So, before we also get started on the indigenous groups, let's talk about like just the layout of Manitoba. Saskatchewan was a giant rectangle, and this one is a little more funky shape, and so I did a bad job on drawing it. However, right now, there is a picture of the province Manitoba, so take a good look at it. Pretty fancy, pretty cool. As you can see, they're surrounded by lakes and all that juicy stuff, and the Hudson Bay. And with that being said, we're back. Bring it back. All right, now let's talk about the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe. That sounds very similar to wasabi. Get out! Oh man. Being said, the Anishinaabe are kind of the groups that were part of the Ojibwe, the Ojibwe, and the Chippewa. They were kind of part of southern Manitoba, and they originally migrated from the Great Lakes of the region. So As you guys probably know, at least for the Eastern Americans and the Eastern Canadians, about the really huge lakes right in between the two countries. And so the Anishinaabe used to inhabit southern present-day Manitoba and the Great Lakes area. And like always, finding this research or finding this information could be hard because as I said in the last video, it's not like they stored all their historical documents into a little folder and then gave it to me thousands of years in the future for me to study. And so, with that being said, if you are part of the First Nations or know anyone that's part of the First Nations, and if I give you a piece of information that is wrong, then please, 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 please send me to court and sue me for $3 billion more. And also, please clear it up in the comment sections because since I don't get a lot of comments and I'm not very famous, I will read every single comment that you guys post on the video, under the video, for I can take a look at it and either improve or make a video saying that, hey, I was wrong and this is what the actual information is. So, with that being said, yeah, let's continue to the video. Also in the description, I'm going to put down my sources. So if you don't believe a word that I'm telling you, just look down in the description and you'll see all the sources in which I used to make this video. Now let's talk about how their government worked. Because their government kind of worked a lot different than most other tribes that were in the region. For example, let me start off by saying that they were semi-nomadic. And for the people who don't know what nomadic means, it's basically moving a lot. So if someone has a nomadic lifestyle, they tend to move a lot from place to place. You know, sometimes they'll return into the same areas, but way down the line. So the Anishinaabe were semi-nomadic, meaning that they were kind of seasonal nomadic. So for example, in the spring and summer, they will be around the Superior Lakes region, like the Great Lakes region. And then during the winter and fall, they will kind of head towards a little bit more to southern Saskatchewan inside the modern day province for gathering. And so they were kind of seasonal movers, nomadic. So with that being said, the Anishinaabe clan had a clan system, and basically the roles and responsibilities of each clan, kind of like departments, was hunting, fishing, healing, and gathering. Healing is more or less like the medics. Fishing, fishing, so that is a seasonal job, as we mentioned. The fishing and gathering were kind of intertwined. They were kind of like the same job description, just depending on the season, the jobs would change. And then hunting was just hunting. I mean, that will never change, because no matter where you are, you'll always have something to kill. Leadership was kind of made mainly of elders, because the elders had a lot of wisdom and experience, because a lot of indigenous and First Nation tribes respected the elders for their wisdom. You know, they've been in the planet for a long period of time, and so they kind of know the do's and don'ts, and they kind of have that morality to them. So yeah, ethical leadership. The community, they cared a lot about community's collective interests and values. Meaning that, let's say that there is a group of elders that, for example, want to stay put in the Great Lakes during winter. And the majority of them say that they want to go to the interior of the land and kind of stay there during the winter. Meaning that they do care about the collective opinions about those around them. Unlike, for example, modern politicians. I'm looking at you. I cannot say a politician name or else people are going to hate on me. I'm looking at politicians, except the small ones. They're chill. With that being said, we also have seasonal counselors or councils. And what these seasonal councils did is that all the leaders, like the elders and the councils, will get together, council members that were also elected based on like the collective interest in communities, wisdom, respect for others, and if they were kind of just well known around their tribe, so they will often be chosen as council. And so the leaders and councils will get together to discuss hunting and harvesting, because hunting and harvesting are two very important things. You don't want to overhunt in your region, because that will lead to the decrease of animals and will make it hard for you in seasonal times to continue doing. And harvesting was important because depending on what your crop was, it will either strive during this season or it will die. And so that's kind of what these meetings were about. Not just that, but they also use these seasonal council members and like people getting together to resolve conflicts. So let's say, as we're going to talk about, there's a lot of indigenous groups in what is now the province of Manitoba, and so a lot of conflicts ended up taking place, and so the seasonal councils kind of helped resolve that conflict in the best way possible without killing a lot of people. And so, with that being said, their government is pretty swaggy, not gonna lie, pretty blinged out. Look at that, pretty fancy. And so now we're gonna be talking about contact with Europeans. So, like in the last video that I mentioned, a lot of these tribes that came in contact with the Europeans kind of got a flaw with their contact. For example, my favorite example to use is the Swigs/Dakota people that after having contact with the European ended up to the Great Dakota War in Minnesota, which ended up with a lot of Dakotas dying and being banished from their land. And so it goes to show that they start out always with trading, as we will see here, and then things kind of get a little bad as time goes on, which leads to a flaw. Every tribe has gotten their flaw, and so now let's talk about the flaw of the Anishinaabe. Contact with Europeans is where things kind of get complicated, at least when it goes to who was first. And so let's just get that out of the way. So European contact came during the early 17th century, so as early as 1612. So let's just talk about that. Mainly it was the French and the British that these tribes kind of saw first. And then technically, if you want to give the first person to enter what is now Manitoba, technically you could say it goes to Samuel de Champlain, who also is known to start the first ever colony in what is now Canada, which was Quebec City. He was the governor of Quebec City and also one of the first ever founders of a colony. So he established the first ever foundation in Canada. So I'll give him that. But whether or not he was the first to enter Manitoba, entirely different thing. Then you have Itineni Bruleli. I hate this guy because he's got such a weird name. And technically the title of first ever to enter Manitoba also goes to him. But like I said, it's really hard to pinpoint the first. However, there is early documentation that Sir Thomas Button was the first to enter northern Manitoba. But then again, you could argue that Henry Hudson was also the first to enter modern day Manitoba, northern Manitoba, because he came through Hudson Bay. So, who do I believe was the first? None of them. It was me. So, I'm not going to say none of them were the first. I'm just basically telling you the early stages of who was there during that time. So if you guys want to do your own independent research or just tell me who you believe was the first one, let me know. But yeah, with that being said, let's talk about relationship. Now, the Anishinaabe loved the French, and the French loved the Anishinaabe. They had alliances with the French. So they signed a lot of treaties and held a lot of allianceships with the French colonists and Europeans. Mainly, these alliances were to battle or have as protection against other tribes for the Anishinaabe and the British for the French. So technically, let's say the Anishinaabe was in a war with the Cree people, they could just call their homeboys the French, and the French will come and take them out. But if the French were having problems with the British, then the Anishinaabe would step in. So it was kind of a love-love relationship. In return, they got a lot of tools and weapons. Mainly, they also got like blankets and like other pottery. Nothing too drastic to me to write down, but mainly tools and weapons. And the Anishinaabe loved the Frenchmen so much that the Anishinaabe adopted certain French cultures and technologies, as well as form of politics. So the French and the Anishinaabe were basically just doing hopscotch in the corner while the rest of the Europeans and tribes were battling with wars and distrust and all that fancy stuff. However, the Anishinaabe cannot get away spot clean because they also had flaws such as diseases, land laws, cultural effects like disruptions. Because like I mentioned, they started adopting French culture, which ruined their original culture. And then exploitation. So because they needed fur, which is what they mainly traded for tools and weapons, then that led to exploitation of land. So they started overhunting, which is a big no-no. And then they became dependent of mainly the French because the French offered them alliances, battles with tribes and tools and weapons, and they had their culture now tied with them. They held a lot of dependence to the French colonists and Europeans. So that sucks. I'm sorry, Anishinaabe. I hope the French didn't make you eat frogs and surrender every battle you fought in. Alright, strap your big boy pants because things are now about to get juicy. So, we gotta talk about the literal entire life of Pierre Garter de Varnes and de la Vertari. Now, I may be pronouncing the name wrong. I am very confident that I got it right this time. However, he was the first European to go into modern day Manitoba. And his entire life was literally dedicated to establishing forts and support and mapping out modern day Western Canada. And so we will be talking about his entire life because after doing research, everything that he did in his life is very important. And I got notes of it, and so sometimes I will be looking down to read part of the notes. But yeah, if you want to take a pause and kind of just get a basic read of what I wrote here, and if you don't care about the whiteboard, then let's just begin. He was born in Torres-Revaris in Quebec on November 17, 1685. At the age of 11 in 1696, his family enrolled him in Jesuit Seminary in Quebec, and just 3 years later, in 1699, joined the New French Army. Keep in mind that New France was the territory and the French presence of North America, and what is now Quebec. So keep that in mind. In 1704 and 1705, so between those 2 years, he was the first cadet, like in his squad, in his regiment, to be ranked as an ensign, and was a part of the conflict in New England and Newfoundland. So there was tensions between the French and the English, establishing territories in Newfoundland and New England, but we won't get into that. But I will just mention that he was a part of that conflict. In 1709, his brother dies in the Spanish succession. So the reason why I mentioned this is because right after he died, he adopted his appellation, La Ventari. So he wasn't named Ventari. He was just named as far back as Pierre Garter de Vanteres or Vaneres. And then, when his brother died, he changed it to Enda La Ventari. So, with that being said, in 1726, he joins his brother, who was the commandant of the Poste del Norte, which was a fort near the Lake Superior region. And that is important because this was his first ever interaction working alongside the forts and kind of building forts, mapping forts. So it was because of his brother that he started getting into that line of work. And he was pretty good at it because 2 years later, in 1728, he becomes commandant of that same fort. So he decides to switch it up a bit, realizing that there's not a lot of French presence in the West because they only have a little bit of forts in New France, in Quebec. And so he decides to ask the governor, Charles de Barujanis, oh man, I butchered that one, I know that for a fact. So in 1728 to 1729, between those 2 years, he pleaded with Governor Charles de Bonaris to support his expedition to go west and continue to build forts there. Because during this time, the HBC, Hudson Bay Company, which I mentioned in the past is the bane of my existence, was making a English presence in the Northwest Territories. Not like the physical Northwest Territories, I'm just talking about like the geographical Northwest Territories. And so he believed that if creating competition with the HBC would strengthen French presence. So after talking to the governor about it, it took a lot of time and debate. But in 1730, both the governor and the intendant, Gilis Jorcares, supported his expeditions to not only go west, but they pleaded with the Ministry of Colonies and got a approval to send Pierre, which I will refer to now from here on out because saying all this is long. Pierre was approved. Shortly after getting approved by the Ministry of Colony in New France, he left on June 8, 1731. He left Montreal with 15 men and his 3 sons. And this would be pretty important. Along with the 15 men, one of his nephews was also there on the route. And keep in mind, he had no financial backing by New France or the King of France. Like, he was given no money for this expedition and to build everything. And so Pierre ended up with 8 partners that helped him with his fur trade monopoly. So in return, they gave him money, and in return, it was more of an investment. As the fur began to roll in, they got a fair share of what he was making. So that is how he was able to fund everything that we're about to talk about. So in August of that same year, Pierre and his men passed, I'm not even going to bother trying saying that, I'm just going to put it on the screen, and Lake Superior, during which Pierre's son and his nephew split along with other men to Rainy Lake, during which Pierre and his men construct Fort Saint Pierre. And in 1732, within the early summer, because keep in mind, they built this fort in the nick of time before winter and stayed there during the winter because winter kills you. In the early summer, in the lakes of the Wood regions in 1732, Fort St. Charles was built. And just next year, a post on the Red River was established. And then next year, in May, Pierre made his way back to Montreal. And he made his way back to kind of inform the investors as well as the people over there what's been going on. Because keep in mind, no one really knows anything that's been going on over here. And so he's making his way back to not only give updates, but pick up more resources and hopefully more men. While the men that he was originally with split up to Lake Winnipeg, and Fort Marquepas was built. So we're seeing a lot of forts being built and a lot of things being discovered. Keep in mind that during these times, they're also making relations with the First Nations in the area, such as the Cree, the Assiniboine, the Dakota, the Lakotas. So a lot of connections are being made and a lot of forts are being established, and they too are collecting a lot of beaver fur. So a lot of money is being made throughout this time. It's funny because while recording this video, I already made it to the capital of Manitoba. So yeah, I'm kind of late on recording the video, but I thought it would be cool to still at least record this part. I am still in like the exploring part of Canada, so talking about Pierre, and so I am very behind schedule. But yeah, look at that, pretty cool. Look at that weird looking golden statue thing. So I wanted to vlog, but I just hate recording in public. It makes me feel weird. But yeah, nice. That's right. It has been a whole month since the last recording. I fell in so late out of schedule that I already been to Winnipeg and Manitoba. So I should just scrap this entire video. It sucks. The history sucks. Nah, I'm messing with you. Nah, yeah, I already been in Winnipeg, so there's kind of like no point anymore. I should have just scrapped this video, to be honest. But I'm determined because I did not just spend 3 months before I went to Winnipeg researching this entire thing just to say I fell behind schedule. I give up. I am not a quitter. So let's continue talking about Pierre. Quebec, 1734. Keep in mind, from the last cut, we saw that he built a bunch of forts. Him and his nephew and his son and all the other men were building forts, establishing trades with the natives and the first tribes near those areas, and was exploring western modern day Manitoba. And you might be thinking, yo, that's pretty sick. You know what? First dude to do it, he must be getting a lot of respect and his reputation must be pretty strong. No, in fact, it was quite the opposite. When he returned to Quebec in 1734, the French government and the French people roasted the living bejesus out of him. Because keep in mind that the whole reason why this expedition was approved and why people wanted to invest in it and why he was given investors and associates was because he promised to find the Pacific Ocean. Because Europe was looking for that ocean that connects North America and Asia for further establishment of trading. Instead of going all the way under Africa and back up to Asia, they figured it would be easier to kind of just head the other way and then just go directly to Asia because they didn't know that a whole continent was in the way. So he returns back to Quebec, he got roasted, and then he's like, all right. Now let me go to find this apparent Pacific Ocean. And you know what? I won't come back until I find it, he said. So he departs on June 1735, and the farthest he ever made it at that time was Lake Winnipeg. So, with that in mind, let me just put a picture of where Lake Winnipeg is and where the Pacific Ocean is. That's right, he's not even 25% of the way there. He is incredibly far. So, he leaves June 1735. And you might be thinking, well, who's supervising all these forts him and his men been building? Well, lucky for us, we know. It was his investors and his associates and trusted men that he had around him. And keep in mind that during this time, his nephew dies. He's given an illness while heading towards a fort and died. Or that his nephew was very, very, very skilled in building these forts. Before he left to Montreal, he sent his nephew out and a couple of his men to Rainy Lake to build forts there. But now that he's gone, a huge piece of that history left with his nephew. So things will kind of get harder as things move on. So let's continue talking about other stuff. Let me punch the camera because I'm pissed. Bang. So you may be thinking, all right, Pierre lost his nephew. There is no way it could get worse than that. Well, his son also dies. Bruh. Yeah, he's been catching so many L's since he left Quebec. And not to mention, his reputation is being tarnished. His nephew, who was a great associate when it came to building these forts and communication with the natives, is now dead. And his son was murdered by Lakota, Dakotas, and Ojibwa on June 6, 1736, along with 19 other men. So 20 total people, including his son, were killed in the Lake of the Woods. And I want to mention his son's name just for he won't be forgotten into history. His name was Jean and Jusur Jean Pierre Alunia. I hate French people. So on September 28, 1738, he makes it all the way to the mouth of the Assiniboine River, which is literally present-day Winnipeg. So he makes it where Winnipeg is. And he decides to build near there, along with some other men, Fort La Reine, and he establishes it in October. Fort La Reine is then switched to a very famous place that, if you watch my Saskatchewan video, you might be familiar with, Porte La Piari. So he establishes the future Porte La Piari, which is named after Piari, or Pierre, as I like to call him, because it's already too late to pronounce it right. So he makes it all the way over there, and in December 3rd, the farthest he ever made it, North Dakota. That's right, this dude from Quebec managed to walk, hike, and survive all the way to North Dakota. And he's not even halfway to the Pacific Ocean. So I genuinely feel bad for this dude. So he decides to spend the winter after realizing that he is out of resources. He is grieving the loss of his son and nephew, and then he realizes that most of his men were now in Porte La Pieri. He decides, that's it, I'm gonna go back, I'm done. So he spends the winter in Porte La Pieri and then heads back to Montreal. He's back in Montreal. Things are going bad for him. Turns out the French government hates him. So his sons, though, on the other hand, so entirely different scenery, the ones that are still alive, of course, are currently in the Saskatchewan River and the nearby areas establishing forts in 1741, which is good, you know. Keep in mind how much the Piari family has put. They have explored Manitoba, was one of the first to even head west within those areas, southwest at least, you know, northwest, HBC, so that doesn't count. But southwest goes to the Pierre family. They established a bunch of forts. They built communication with the natives in the area. They learned the language. They learned their culture. And things are going great for not only the French government, because a lot of trade is coming in, but employees are being put within these forts. It is a great thing. But France doesn't think that. That's right. When he resigns, Pierre resigns in 1743, and then the French says that everything he discovered, did, and built has no importance.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
You should have found the Pacific. Womp womp, little bro. That's right. Now, they basically didn't account for anything that he discovered or built. They didn't give him any medals. They gave him zero pay. They gave him nothing. So, I hate you, French people. So, however, Governor Bino Janinos, who was the original person who gave Pierre the permission to go and build these forts and explore the West and go to the Pacific, in 1944 decides to fight his case with the King of France at the time, King Louis. And so he spent the next 5 years pleading with the monarch French government as well as the French colonies to recognize the work that Pierre done, because they realized, hey, without this dude ever existing, we would have never made it that far west. And so the king, thankfully, finds doing something right in his goddamn life. I had it with you. He decides to give him the best ever medal known to man, the highest award possible at the time at least. And that was the Croix de Saint Boyes. It was the highest award you could get in monarch France. It was such a high award that very little people accomplished getting that award. And not just that, but King Louis also made him the manager and in charge of a lot of posts in the West that he established. So basically, he was just managing what he built, which is not kind of a big honor, but that right there is a big honor. Thumbs up, French government. And so that was kind of one of the last things notable that Pierre did during his life. On December 5th, 1749, that same year he was given that award, unfortunately, he was planning on going to explore the Saskatchewan River to establish more forts there. But sadly, he died in Montreal, barely seeing the recognition that he got for his work and his family. Now you might be thinking, did he get money? Did he get money? That's the important thing I'm answering. Did he get money? Is his family respected now by the French government? And both answers is no. He got no money. His sons, after he died, got no money from his will or anything because he was broke. And the only thing they got was a lousy medal, which, yeah, it's cool. But Pierre literally is the reason why Manitoba is where it's at today. So, womp womp, French government. I am very disappointed. I feel like Pierre got the last laugh because you see, the French kings later down the line were beheaded. Aha, suckers. And Pierre's family kind of ended up being very, down the line, very successful politicians. In fact, so the future generations of Pierre's family, down the line, we have a gentleman named John C. Fremont, and he became the first Republican candidate in U.S. California. So it's really interesting how the family of Pierre, like his bloodline, were really interesting. His grandfather was an explorer, like Pierre's grandfather and his father, and then he served in the military and became like an explorer and an establisher. His sons continue his legacy. And then way down the line, we see that they are still involved in getting involved in politics and exploration and doing new things. Yeah, shout out to John C. Fremont, and not shout out to the French government. How dare you disrespect my boy Pierre. All right, let's talk about the Métis before we even start talking about this, because I need to explain that. So when a mommy Native American and a daddy European dance on the bed for a couple minutes, pop goes the weasel, and you have a Métis. A Métis is a person who is both of European ancestry and First Nation or Native American. So Native American woman with European man, you have a Métis. And it was kind of weird for Métis to exist during this time period, because keep in mind that Europeans still considered the First Nations savages. King of Europe and the King of France considered these people like nations and territories and boundaries unrecognizable under colonial law. And so it was weird kind of seeing the Métis people, because they didn't necessarily fit in directly with a certain group. They were always welcome in their indigenous tribes. However, sometimes they were just frowned upon because they were part European, part of the white man. Don't want to get that vocabulary out of the way. The Métis are European and Native combined into one, kind of a little fusion dance. But yeah, with that being said, let's talk about the HBC, my favorite thing in the whole wide world, and the NWC, the Northwest Company. During the 1800s, it was an interesting time for modern day territories of Manitoba. There was a lot of traction between these two companies. There were competitors at the time, and the fur trade was getting a little too serious. So much so that these companies often clashed with each other, with certain forts, with their production. They would sometimes stop ships and tax them for no reason. It was a messy thing during that time. All right, now let's talk about my boy, Thomas Douglas V of Earl Selkirk. He was an Irish politician, even though he was born in the UK, was an employee to the Hudson Bay Company. I talked to the governor at the time and kind of gave him the idea, hey, you guys are struggling with crops, with agriculture, because you're so far up north, your plants are going so let me help you. Give me 116,000 square miles near the Red River, which is like modern day Winnipeg, and let me and my Irish folks kind of grow crops for you. Because at this time, a lot of Scottish and Irishes were immigrating to the Hudson Bay territories, hoping to get work. But a lot of them got displaced, and a lot of them became jobless because they're drunks. And the HBC hated that. And so he decided to create a separate colony for them, and they began agriculture. So they started growing crops, everything was going all right, and in return, they just gave a huge portion of those crops to the HBC. Everything seems to be going all right? No. The Métis have their own community. They kind of been doing their own community, as well as the Assibonini. And the Assibonini and the Métis both agree that this colony was a big problem. They did not like the presence of that colony being so close to them. And so much so that in 1816, the Battle of Seven Oaks occurred. Now let me read off my notes, because I love writing my notes. Look how pretty they are. Look at them. But yeah, so 1816, the Battle of Seven Oaks. The thing that makes me mad is that when I was in Winnipeg, I was like a 10-minute walk from Seven Oaks, and I completely forgot to go. On June 19, 1816, 60 Métis under Cuthbert Grant, who at the time was a Northwest Company employee, was making his way to the Seven Oaks Fort, which was Fort Douglas. And Robert Semple, who was the governor-in-chief of the Hudson Bay, led 25 soldiers and settlers to parley with the Metis. Parley, for those who don't know, is basically the political term of squaring up. They'll go in person, face to face. Sometimes they'll sit down and have wine and kind of talk about how they could fix this conflict. It was a civilized and respectable thing. The French and the English did it a lot when it came to like battles with the forts, because keep in mind the Northwest Company was a French fur establishment, while the Hudson Bay was English. So they did a lot of these parties where they kind of just sit down. Sometimes a cannon will go off and people will die every now and then. But sometimes, you know, it will just end with chattering. However, this time was completely different because a fight broke out and Semple and 20 men were killed, while Grant, who was leading the Metis, only lost one dude. That's right. While the governor-in-chief of the Hudson Bay and 20 other men were killed, Grant only lost one guy. So only 5 soldiers from the Hudson Bay Company lived to tell the tale of what happened, which is why we know that Grant forced the remaining settlers to leave Fort Douglas because he threatened to massacre the rest of the people within Fort Douglas. And just like that, the fort fell apart and the red colonies to kind of abandon the post. And you might be thinking, that's it. Fort Douglas is no more. The Metis won. We got the good ending. No, because next year it just came back.
What the hell?
Simple as that. People came, they restored the fort, and they're like, all right, we're back in business. But yeah, with that being said, let's just talk real quick about 1821 too, since, I already got it here. Northwest Company, keep in mind, these were Frenchies, you know. The British did not like the Frenchies, just like I don't like the French government after dissing my boy Pierre. I'm kidding, that's a joke. But they decided in 1821, you know what, we gotta stop with all of this fighting. We're losing a lot of men, because keep in mind that most of these people that worked at the forts were not soldiers. Realistically, they were just traders, they were blacksmiths, they were like carpenters. Now, really little of them were actual soldiers that knew how to operate their fancy muskets and whatnot. So they do a parley, so both of the chiefs and governors at the time sit down, and they're like, all right, how are we gonna do this? And then the Northwest Company decides, hey, let's do a little fusion dance. Let's merge both of our companies into one entity. And they did just that. So the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest combined, and now they became one super big established fur trading company. So Hudson Bay kept the name and Northwest Company disappeared. All right, so let's fast forward now a couple of years. The Red Colonies, where it's now modern day Winnipeg, has been there for a couple of decades now, and things keep brewing up between the Metis and the local indigenous communities and the Irish, and now future Englishmen and Frenchmen who now live in that colony. So what's happening? The next big milestone that happens to the creation of Manitoba, because keep in mind, Manitoba is a no-no. It doesn't exist yet. It is just in your head. You schizophrenic. In 1869, what I like to call the fall of the Hudson Bay Company, because Rupert's Land is about to be sold to now the newly made country, Canada. There's a lot of issues going on because the fall of the Hudson Bay was because of a lot of things, and to kind of dumb it down, because I do plan to make a video about the entire rise and fall of the Hudson Bay Company and its whole little empire they did. It was because of Britain, Canada, the United States, the French, the First Nations, and the Metis that the Hudson Bay finally couldn't keep up. They were battling against all these different nations and people that it was to a point where they just couldn't anymore. The rise of fur was kind of declining. A lot of First Nations that they used to trade with have all kind of been killed due to diseases. Separation was going on between forts. The French have been attacking their forts for God knows how long. And Britain has persuaded them to sell all of their land, which I will put a picture of it right now. As you can see, they own basically 75, 65%, I guess, if I shouldn't just blindly say which number, of Canada, modern day Canada. So they own a lot of territory. But they were persuaded by Britain to sell it to the Canadians rather than the United States, because the United States wanted to buy it for a really high price. I can't remember the number on the top of my head, but they wanted to buy it for a big chunk of price, but Britain said no, sell it to your little brother Canada. During the entire sidelines, they not once considered the Red River colonies. Not once were they allowed to share their opinion, or were they allowed to kind of talk to anyone involved in this negotiation. In fact, they had zero saying in what was going on. So the Métis and the First Nations weren't really happy about that, since they live there too, and it's their land. So a huge confusion is going on right now, and will lead to the future rise of the Red River colonies and Luis Rial. This is now where Manitoba begins to kind of take shape, take form, and kind of getting its reputation. And that is because of the rise of Luis Rial, who is a Métis, who was part of the Métis community in the Red River colonies. But before we talk about that, let's talk about what's going on through the Canadian government side. In August of 1869, the Canadian government decides that they want to resurvey the Red River colonies farms, which is right in like the river line of the Red Rivers. So a lot of people during this time are afraid, at least Métis wise, because they are about to enter, unwillingly going to enter a new form of government under the Canadian Confederation. And so, to kind of ease down the tensions going on, the people in Ottawa released kind of a report or a statement saying that they intended to respect Métis rights. So, what were these Métis rights they allegedly intended to respect? That was their farmland, their culture, their rights as a human being, and religion. And then they put this guy in charge, William McDougall, which he was appointed as the lieutenant governor, which you might hear the name and you're like, Hermie, why is this guy all of a sudden evil? Well, he's evil because he's a expansionist. He strongly agrees with the idea to expand westward, because keep in mind that Western Canada is kind of uninhabited currently in the moment. And just like the Americans, they believe in, or at least he believes in, manifest destiny. Rah! But the Canadian version of it, whatever they called it. But he was an expansionist, that we can agree on. So the Métis are not liking this at all. This guy's in charge. The Canadian government is not really listening to them. And so far, not a single Métis representative or any form of high authority has able to give their opinion of what is going on. The land transferring between the HBC, Rupert's Land, and the Canadian government. No one has been able to say a word. So, next, in just a couple months, in November 1869, Luis Rial is the Métis spokesman, becomes the Métis spokesman, and kind of begins the negotiation of kind of the right, the protection of the rights. Now, does the Canadian government listen? No! Bruh. They're too busy eating maple syrup and playing hockey. He also prevented William McDougall and a group of the resurveys to not enter the Red River colony. In fact, it became kind of a standstill. Things are becoming a little bit spicy. The government isn't liking it. The Red River is definitely not liking it. And the Métis are for sure not liking it. During this entire time, keep in mind that the Hudson Bay Company remains neutral. Yes, they're technically still part of Rupert's Land, but the Hudson Bay also does not make any form of statement or any form of negotiation for the Métis against the Canadian government. In my opinion, I want to add that the Hudson Bay, in a way, it's also the victim of what is going on here. I won't dive into it right now because I do plan to make a larger video about only the Hudson Bay, but in a sense, they're kind of also the victim. Like, they're not good guys, but they're not bad guys, you know. During the early stages of the Hudson Bay, and like even during the 1800s, they helped the natives a lot. And they helped the Métis a lot in some sense. I mean, keep in mind that the Red River colonies were established under the Hudson Bay to kind of create farmland and put misplaced folks that were mainly Irish or Scottish here to kind of create their own agriculture, to kind of make them fit in somewhere. But however, the Metis kind of didn't like that, and now we're kind of in this whole mess of who's in the right, who's in the wrong. Land is being transferred. What's going to be the rights of that? So everything is becoming new, and everyone is kind of in a standstill of what is going on. But things will only get worse from here. Don't worry. All right. The day is December 1st, 1869. That is the official day when Rupert's Land is now going to merge with the Canadian Confederacy, and all the land will become Canada's. Does that happen is the real question. No. In fact, quite the opposite. The Metis have been holding on this kind of fight for nearly a whole month since McDougall visited the Red colonies, and Rial and the Metis didn't let him in. In fact, no one was let into these colonies and forts, which we will later talk about Fort Garry. And so, because no one was able to get access to these kind of crucial land areas, the land couldn't be transferred because no one was allowed to be placed in. So, Luis Rial and Metis supporters also were resisting to give up Fort Garry. Fort Garry at the time was the main facility of the Hudson Bay Company. That's where all the important stuff and the biggest facility of them all was located. And so, because the Metis and Luis Rial conquered it and took it, they refused to give it up and refused to let anyone in until the Canadian government allowed a Metis representative to go and speak and begin negotiations on how this land should properly be transferred. So I know a while back I mentioned that there's two kinds of Metis. So let's talk about these two kinds and kind of better understand where they aligned themselves when it came to the transfer of power and the land that they were surrounded in. So you've got two forms of Metis. You have the Anglophone and the Francophone. The Anglophones were English-speaking Metis/settlers. So these were the people that, keep in mind that Metis are a mix of European and indigenous. So that is what the Anglophones were. They were English Metis. So they came from English ancestry. So their father might have been British, which, oh, how scary is that? And they supported the expansion of English Canada and desired policies aligned with British traditions because they were very close aligned to the British, and viewed the Francophones as an obstacle to this bullet point. They viewed the Francophones that they were getting in the way of Canadian expansion to the West. And they dismissed Metis' rights to land and culture. So they had a big problem with the fact that the Metis wanted to keep certain land after the power would be transferred to Canada. They viewed it as everyone should just be under one roof of just the Canadian government. But the Francophones didn't really feel the same way about that. Keep in mind that Anglophones were mainly made up of Protestants. As you can see, this will also become a religious matter. So they were mainly Protestants. And then you have the Francophones, who were French-speaking, which, as we established, Metis, European, and indigenous mixed together. Keep that in mind. It is very important. So they came mainly from French-speaking. So their father or mother may have been French. Ugh, how scary. They were huge to advocate for the rights of Metis land and language and Catholic religion. Keep in mind that these people, the Francophones, were mainly Catholic and opposed the unregulated English expansion of West. So they wanted to make sure that if the Canadian government were to expand west, they wanted it to be in an ethical form. They didn't mind that they were heading west. It was how they were doing it that was making them mad. Completely ignoring Metis in general, and then just going unchecked, heading westward. I wonder who did that. I'm looking at you, Americans. So they sought recognition. They wanted to be recognized as their own form of people, their own ethnicity, their own culture. They were unique and they wanted to be seen as that. and they wanted representation. They heavily lacked representation. The only few times where Metis were involved with talking to the government were the Anglophone. And as you can see, it was for good reason, because the Anglophone didn't mind how the English were expanding their borders. But these guys did. So when you were going to pick which Metis to talk to, and if I were a Canadian government, I would have chose the Anglophone because they mostly aligned with the beliefs at the time, while the Francophones demanded too much. God forbid we actually care about the rights of the Metis and the land they acquired. And real quick too, I want to mention kind of the key conflict points. So why did they kind of opposite? Why did they hate each other aside from what I literally just mentioned? It was culture clashes, which were the English-speaking Protestants versus the French Catholics, and then land disputes. Anglophones ignored Metis traditional land holdings, while the Francophones hated that the Anglophones were ignoring their traditional land holdings. And then you had government representations, where the Francophones felt excluded, while the Anglophones felt were being included. And Luis Rial, he has his own bullet point, because the Anglophones looked at him as a rebel, while the Francophones looked at him as a unifying figure. All right, so why mention this? Why mention the vocabulary between the Anglophones and the Francophones? Because I want to get the point across that these guys are 100% opposite from each other. In 1870, they held a convention. That means that the Anglophones and the Francophones sat together. They had one convention before this one, which took place in January 1870, the second one. And the first convention was mainly with the Francophones. And they elected Luis Rial, as well as elected the idea of becoming a provincial representative government, meaning that they wanted to be a province. The second convention was held in January 1807, and throughout this time, Luis Rial somehow, some way, in some magical twist of events, got the Anglophones to agree with Luis Rial. So now you got most, if not all, Francophones, and most, if not all, Anglophones now supporting and electing Luis Rial. A proposed idea comes. Now that they have a not only elective representative, but what is now what I like to consider the first premier of Manitoba, even though it wasn't officially stated, or he wasn't officially given that title until 2016. He was the first premier of Manitoba, even before Manitoba was a thing. Keep in mind, Manitoba does not exist yet. However, it is in the verge of it. With Luis Rial now elected to be the provincial representative government, he, along with the Metis and the Canadian government, is ready to negotiate for the province of Manitoba. The Canadian government is ready to listen. The Metis have always been ready to listen, but now, lucky for him, he got the Anglophone on his side, and he is a provincial representative government. He is ready. He got power. Yay! Thomas Scott. Who is he? Why was he so important when he was executed? And why did this eventually lead to the downfall of Luis Rial? So, let's talk about him. He was a Protestant that was from Ontario, and he moved to the Red River colony seeking for better opportunities. So he was an Anglophone by definition. He was a Metis, and he was convicted of treason because at the time, the government of the Assiniboine, or the Assiniboine, was being disrupted by Thomas Scott. He didn't agree with them. He aligned himself heavily with the Canadian Party, and because during this entire controversy was going on, was still arguing both publicly and kind of making a ruckus throughout the colony about them joining Canada and stop being so heavily tied to their culture. And so this ended up leading to his arrest, and he was convicted of treason. His court, however, is where the problem began, because he had, in my opinion, or at least everyone will agree of what I will tell you right now, a very unfair trial. He was not given a lawyer for very obvious reasons, because they didn't want him to win, to start off with. From the looks of it, they didn't want him to win. And two, he did not speak a ounce of French, while everyone else in that colony mainly did speak French. And so he had no idea what the court was saying about him. He had no way to communicate with the judge or the 6-member council that ended up sending him to execution. He didn't know nothing. And so because he didn't know nothing, there was nothing he could say or do. So after the court ended, the six council members decided that the best course of action was to shoot him, firing squad style. Things get more tense because keep in mind, the Canadian government is ready to talk. There is no more issues anymore. All they want now is a representative from the Red River colonies to go to Ottawa and talk. And now they're about to kill an innocent person just because he was yapping too much in town square. And the government pleaded to let him go. Not only did the government plead, but the priest of the Red River colonies did as well. And for the first time ever since this entire controversy began, the HBC spoke out. And Donald Smith, who was the governor, last governor of the Hudson Bay Company, spoke out, also pleading for him to be released. Luis Rial said no, that he had to be made an example, that he was quoted saying, "Canada has to take us seriously." With the time ticking at 1 o'clock on March 4th, 1870, Scott's hands were tied behind his back, and he was escorted from his cell to the courtyard right outside the Red River colonies. With Rial watching, Scott knelt in the snow, and with a white cloth to cover his eyes, Scott shouted, "This is horrible. This is cold-blooded murder." 6 Metis men, who I'm assuming were the 6 council members that sentenced him to death, raised their muskets, but when ordered to fire, only a few shots rang out. Scott was hit twice and crumbled to the ground, but he was still alive, meaning there was still hope to change their mind and to not go forward with this execution. However, Francis Garlemate, a member of the firing squad, stepped forward, withdrew his revolver, and shot Scott in the head, sealing Luis Rial's fate, because now the Canadian government was after him. The controversy of Scott's death was very important because, yes, he was a yapper. Yes, he wasn't kind of ready to let the Red River colonies join Manitoba the way he wanted to. He believed that should just be taken over. However, it wasn't the fact that his opinions got him killed was the controversy. That seemingly this innocent man, who, keep in mind, yes, he was no saint. I mean, he did try to kill his boss and drown him in a river one time, and he did have a big mouth, yes, so he wasn't no saint. However, you shouldn't kill a man just because he didn't agree on your beliefs. And so the controversy around Scott's execution did not change MacDonald's mind. So Ramsay MacDonald, who was the prime minister at the time, of course, to ease kind of the Ontarian people's anger, had to deploy 1,200 men to the Red River colonies. And just before they arrived in August, Luis Rial had already fled to the United States. During this time, though, Prime Minister MacDonald welcomed representatives from the Red River to negotiate. He agreed with most of Rial's terms, which, keep in mind, he couldn't be present for this historical moment due to the actions that he made. But anywho, his terms included the promise of Manitoba's guaranteed protection of Metis land. Because remember, that was the number one concern that we talked about. The Catholic religion, which was also important, the French language, which was also important, and the treaties for negotiation with indigenous nations. So, seems that everyone could now agree to this conclusion. And in July 1870, Manitoba officially became a province. Sadly for Luis Rial, he was not able to be there during that time. So going back to Thomas Scott, why was it such a big deal? Yes, one life for such a great historical moment. Some will even consider that a sacrifice. But to many Canadians, it wasn't. A lot of Canadians that were originally either visiting or heard about the news went back to Ontario to spread propaganda against Luis Rial, since they did not support Luis Rial in the first place. And now that this murder was committed, it was a perfect time to spread hateful propaganda against him. Rial's part in Scott's execution destroyed his ability to participate in Canadian politics. He was this close to greatness, and he missed it. Because Rial was elected as a member of parliament for Manitoba, and he was elected in the House of Commons in 1873 and 1874. However, because there was a $5,000 bounty on his head, he never went to the House of Commons. He never got to participate through politics. But however, in 1885, he did end up coming back to Canada. He went back to Saskatchewan and he led the Métis in the Northwest Resistance, which is its entire thing, but that is now Saskatchewan history. It is no longer Manitoba. So this caused, Ontarian Protestants to demand his arrest again, and he was eventually arrested and charged with high treason, which ended up to him being hanged. Look at that. Isn't history funny? They got their province, and in return, Luis Rial was hanged. So it is still debated throughout modern history, or through historians, and including myself, because I'm even stuck between the line of, was he a good guy? Was he really the founder of Manitoba? Does he deserve that title? Because think about it. A lot of people argued before 2016 that Luis Rial was in fact the first premier of Manitoba, and now we know that it is true because he was recognized officially by the Canadian government in 2016. I feel like the reason why it took so long is because not a lot of people were ready to accept the fact that a cold-blooded murderer was the first premier of Manitoba. Even though, let me argue, because I love to argue, he didn't even pull the trigger. It was that other French guy. So, I don't know, arrest him. But he did lead his execution, and there was a whole trial. So, a lot of people go to the hand of, hey, he was innocent. There was a court trial. And yes, even though Luis Rial was present, he didn't convict he didn't convict Thomas Scott. It was the 6 councilmen. And I'm assuming, I don't know if this part is true, but because they're the same number of the councilmen and the executioners, I'm assuming they're the same folks. But the other 6 who were part of the firing squad also shot Thomas Scott. Even though Luis Rial was present and could have stopped it at any time, he didn't. And that was the problem. And so, now Luis Rial is dead. Alright, so Manitoba is a province now. So let me just correct some things because I was talking a little bit too fast in the last clips about Thomas Scott. And so I just wanted to clarify some things. The name Manitoba comes from a Cree word. So remember, I don't know if I mentioned this, but actually, let me mention this right now. Lord have mercy. I am falling behind schedule. So when I was talking about Native Americans, I don't think I mentioned the other natives that were there by name. I know I mentioned them in the Saskatchewan video, but I don't know if I mentioned them here because I mentioned them there. And so I was probably thinking at the time I shouldn't probably mention it. But I know I mentioned the Ojibwe and the Chippewa and the Anishinaabe. However, the other natives that used to roam this land were also the Cree, the Dakota, Lakota, Dini, and the Assibonini. And so the name Manitoba comes from a Cree word, man into huapau, and basically means the narrows of the Great Spirit. And then Manitoba, I messed up. So the last clip I mentioned that it became a province in July. I messed up. I was wrong. Sue me for $3 billion because it officially became a province in May 12, 1870. And also I want to mention, like I said, I was yapping so much about Thomas Scott. I felt behind to clarify some other things. The provincial government that was originally organized in what is now the province of Manitoba was originally called the Provincial Government Organized the Territory of the Assibonini. Bruh. And so that was founded and formed in March 1870. And so once Manitoba became a province, not only did they clearly keep their original territory, but they also got a lot more to expand on, which is not the original size of what is modern Manitoba. It was basically just a nice little square. And also I should mention that the Canadian government apparently was going to keep the end of their bargain by kind of respecting culture, ensuring land was being protected from the Metis and whatnot, but they did not fully comply to their promises. As many Canadian citizens might know, at least those that know the history, the Canadian government has a habit of not keeping their end of the deal, not only with the Manitoba natives, but the Saskatchewan ones, the Nunavut's, Inuit, every native kind of got their deals corrupted as time went on. But yeah, wanted to clear that air, so thumbs up. And then in 1881, the borders of Manitoba expanded, so it was no longer a square and got its funky little shape that we know now. And how did it get it exactly? And in order to understand that, we must understand Northwest Territories. Northwest Territories were once Rupert's land, but was sold to Canada, and now it's just this big chunk of empty territory. So that's kind of where the border came from. So I mentioned in my last video, Frederick Holton, who was the first premier of Northwest Territories, wanted to cut the province in half, but Prime Minister Laurier wanted to cut into half of the half. But before that, it was actually cut up into more little pieces. Northwest Territories was cut into half of the other half, but only 25% of the half. And then Nunavut, that wasn't a territory until the late 90s, I believe, had a part called the Kinuit District. And from that district, once it stopped existing, I guess, because it used to be like a official district of Canada with its own borders and whatnot, it was taken out and given to Manitoba. So that is how Manitoba got taller. And Ontario also got a huge portion of the Kinuit District that comes from Northwest Territories, that comes from Nunavut. And so, yeah, I love Canadian history because the borders, all of the borders in some way, shape, or form expanded because of the Northwest Territories. And so just in my last video, I'm gonna cut it right here because this is the part where I would love, I know I'm a small channel, so I know no one's gonna comment, but I would love like these ends of the videos to kind of end a little bit like once the province is formatted, so that way people of Manitoba have the opportunity to comment, to add more of like what's going on in modern age Manitoba and what's going on politically, or if there was something I missed that I should talk about. So this kind of time where you Manitobans get the spotlight for exactly 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1, all right, you missed it. I will no longer be reading your comment. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please check out my shorts too. My shorts aren't fully entitled to Canada, but I like to talk about almost anything there. And next video hopefully won't be about Canada, because I keep talking a lot about Canada, not enough of the US. I feel like I should do a video about the history of Arizona or something, because I'm currently in Arizona. This is where I study. So hopefully I'll be doing that. I'm not sure yet. However, I'm currently filming this in December 10, and so I'm about to leave the next day for Christmas break, which is why I also have to cut it short. And so yeah, maybe when I come back for next semester, you will see more content. Hopefully, I also don't want to make super long videos because I know no one will be watching for this long. And yeah, that's about it, man. Please leave a comment, like, subscribe. Give me $30 million, Mr. Beast. And see ya. Wouldn't want to be ya.
And what does that make, ketchup?
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Hey, funny guy! I got a joke for you! What smells rotten and puts people to sleep?
Noxious gas?
No! Your act!